Hello. Good evening, everyone. Stragglers, please come in, take seats. We have a full row at the front. Hi, everyone. Welcome this evening, those of you in the room and those of you online. My name is Claire Bishop, and I'm a professor in the Art History Department here at the Graduate Center. I have to do some thank yous before we start. So thank you to Karen Sander in Public Programs, who has organized this whole technological miracle of the setup. Thank you to the Center for Humanities. Thank you to the PhD program in art history, especially a couple of students who are helping us out, Kyle and Ateret. Thank you to NYU and Princeton for supplying some money for drinks afterwards. And thank you, Emilie Boone, for suggesting this panel to us, proposing it to us. It's great to have you back in the building. So what is this panel about? It has the great name, Vision is a Battlefield. A sort of a combination of Pat Benatar and what was the other thing I said? It was a kind of a combination of a couple of cheesy songs from the 80s. So basically thinking about technologies of vision and their use and abuse and how these are, well, if you're thinking about what was the norm in writing around this as a kind of big topic of research amongst artists and scholars, I think from the 80s onwards, where there was a surge of critical writing, especially around photography, its use in criminology, in psychiatry, by colonial missionaries, by ethnographers, and so on. And this writing from the 80s and 90s tended to mobilize feminism, psychoanalysis, post-colonial theory, and Foucault to formulate a long history of media as coercive and oppressive, and to reveal how its perceived neutrality and transparency is in fact a technique of discipline and control. Today, I think we're in a completely different moment, and I hope that this panel is going to help clarify what has changed. Technologies of vision now, of course, encompass machinic vision in the form of drones, satellite mapping, facial recognition software, and much more. And scholars have responded to these challenges by roving more broadly across a wider range of disciplinary methods. And I think one of the most important of these shifts has been the incursion of Black studies into thinking about visuality, which has provided new conceptual terms and frameworks and methods of writing. And I think each of these writers reflect in different ways this incursion of Black studies and also of new types of media, new understandings of media and technology. So we've got these 4 books. Let me just put up an image. All published in the last 12 months. And each of them, oh, actually, no, back an image. There we go, there's the 4 covers. Each of them show the extent to which vision remains a battlefield. So the format tonight is that I'm going to quickly introduce the 4 speakers, who will then have 5 minutes to introduce a capsule sample of arguments from their books. Then we'll then have a general discussion, there'll be time for some Q&A, and we have to wrap up at 7:45. So the idea is to keep this informal and conversational. Look, no podium, no table, and I'm going to exercise my reputation as a brutal timekeeper. First, introductions. Monica Huerta is based in the English and American Studies departments programs at Princeton. The Unintended is her second book. The first, Magical Habits, puts forward a genre-bending combination of history and storytelling, using her experiences of growing up in her family's Mexican restaurants in Chicago to address the legacies of racial capitalism. Emilie Boone is a professor in the African American and African Diaspora Arts in the Department of Art History at NYU and also teaches uptown at the Institute of Fine Arts. For many years, Emilie worked at CUNY City Tech, so welcome back to CUNY, where she assembled an archive on vernacular photographs of Black women. She has an ongoing relationship with the Ghetto Biennial in Haiti, and Haitian photography is going to be the topic of her next book, right? You say no if I get any of this wrong, okay. Brooke Belisle is a professor in the art department at Stony Brook, where she also directs the Interdisciplinary Graduate Certificate in Media, Art, Culture, and Technology. I'm sure that has a good acronym, right? Do you call it MACT? So she's published on a wide range of interests, from 19th century stereographs to Google Earth, VR immersion, and game history, and on contemporary artists like Trevor Paglen and Lorna Simpson. And she's currently working on the aesthetics of astronomical imaging, a project that has the great title of Seeing Stars. And then finally, Nick Mirzoeff, who's a professor in the Media, Culture and Communication Department at NYU Steinhardt. His list of publications addressing the politics of vision is long and notable, from Watching Babylon in 2005 to The Right to Look, 2011, to How to See the World in 2015, to The Appearance of Black Lives Matter in 2018. And his books, I think, are notable for drawing on centuries of visual culture and art history, which he rereads through a contemporary activist lens. So, welcome. Let's get going with some pictures. And I'm going to ask Monica to start. You 1 slide and 5 minutes to talk about how these images provide an entry point to thinking through the historical intersection of race and media. Go.
Thank you, Claire. So first, I'm so happy to be here. Just know that, and I won't take too much time for my time. So I want to start with an invitation into the book, with the fact that there's 3 kinds of writing in the book. There's a speculative preface, there's the traditional voice of a scholarly monograph in the middle of the book, and then the book ends with my experiment trying to write like a coworker. So I was trying to think of a writing that assumes the space to keep working while I'm working alongside other folks' ideas. And one of the reasons why I am committed to thinking with the visual is because I think there's a whole ecosystem of folks who are thinking with the visual in order to rethink the forms that we write in. So that's one of the main ways that I locate my book. But Oscar Wilde. So Oscar Wilde was in New York in 1882 to start a 15,000-mile, 11-month-long publicity tour where he gave 140 lectures in 260 days and was interviewed 98 times. The tour was to publicize Patience, or Bunthorne's Bride, a Gilbert and Sullivan production, then making its American debut. The photographer, Napoleon Cerrone, not Wilde, was then a well-known celebrity photographer. So fetching was this version of Wilde's portrait that a men's clothing store commissioned the Burrow-Giles Lithographic Company to copy it for use in advertisements for its store. The store was hoping to improve its hat sales and bring Wilde's European flair to its customers. That's the company against which Cerrone brings his action for copyright infringement. What the court had to decide was how to parse this photograph as a creative expression, which involved deciding what distinguished this photograph from photographs already, by then, in common use as evidence in court. Assigning a copyright, the right to publication, of course, would determine to whom profit belonged, to the person depicted, to the person whose materials created the image, or to the company that was reproducing the image. So, a zoom out. The unintended follows one central question. How can studies of racial capitalism help us attune in an aesthetic register to the adjudication of photographic images for copyright involved in delimiting a right to privacy, that's the 3rd chapter, and publicity rights, that's the 4th chapter. In the book, I have a very tight focus on precedent-setting legal episodes to tell stories about photography's history as property. I can say more about that decision in Q&A. But with that tight focus, I ask questions about the connection between reading and thinking of photographs as expressions and the idea of value extracted and value produced at stake in property protections and images. What I was trying to understand was how lawyers, photographers, and subjects in the late 19th century articulated photography's harms and claims to art in properties terms from inside the history of race. What I was able to piece together, I think, was a specific aesthetics of whiteness inscribed into property protections over images. I can say much more about that in Q&A as well. But why I think this vantage on value, property, expression, and photography matters is that I give not only specificity to the abstractions through which racial capitalism reproduces itself, but I also give coordinates for a racialized choreography for expression that becomes encoded in intellectual property law that then also maps onto how whiteness becomes a purportedly neutral idea of performing an expression. To my mind, that specificity and locatedness and the method I propose are my contributions both to studies of race and visuality and to humanistic studies of law. I think of my book as sitting on a shelf near Nick's book I hope you think so too. So you might read Nick's book for a kind of wide view of what he's calling white sight, and you might read my book for a close look at the consolidation of that sight in late 19th century IP law. Do I have time for Wilde still? Yes, back to Wilde. So in chapter 2, I read the court's thinking about how it can be that Cerrone holds the copyright in a portrait of Oscar Wilde with Brenna Boundar's distillation of the colonial logics of property as productive of abstractions for value that are themselves already racialized. That's a crucial point from her book, and that crucial point from her book resounds in other studies of racial capitalism, Jennifer Morgan, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Tiffany King, Sadie Hartman, on, that the abstractions through which value is assessed, extracted, claimed, and denied, right, the abstractions through which those things happen, are already racialized at the moment of their invention. For this chapter with Wilde, how I was able to read the legal reasoning this way was by thinking of the court's language in relation to the thick print and performance culture of Wilde as a racialized caricature. I lean on the incredible archival work of Michelle Mendelsohn especially. The context of Wilde's racialization, separate and apart from Wilde's own very active forming of former Confederates, as Imani Perry reminds us in Bexy Thing. But this print and performance culture context matters to my reading and the court case because the court's justification of photographic copyright managed Wilde's racialized position as queer Irish colonial subject by imagining that Cerrone has the capacity to manipulate even Wilde's facial expressions that he does not know that he's making through the metric of an arrangement. Arrangement is the court's term. As imagined by Judge Miller in a case that Cerrone ultimately won, the supposed arrangement, made visual by and in the photograph, could only be imagined by way of Wilde's incapacity to affect his own expression. I end the chapter about copyright with copyright in a photograph forged as a figural capacity to control what another could not or did not or might have, but did not have the capacity to claim. The property relation where Cerrone could own a portrait of Wilde was exclusionary in form because it already relied on an expression itself as the purview of whitened reading and making. And so, just as the arrangement of expression in the photographic portrait depended on conferring to Cerrone the capacity to arrange Wilde, so too did that make copyright a mode through which to imagine whiteness in continuing control of the terms of identity and difference by conferring on its gaze the power to pose anyone, anything, one way or another before a camera shutter even closed. Thank you.
Emily.
Is the mic on? Yes, it is. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited to hear from panelists and during the Q&A and our discussion. So my book, A Nimble Arc, one of the intentions of the book, really the sole intention, was to tell a different narrative about James Van Der Zee. James Van Der Zee being the preeminent at least in art history, the preeminent African-American studio photographer from the Harlem Renaissance era. When we talk about Black photographers, the three, I would say, really big names within the field are Roy de Carava, Gordon Parks, and Van Der Zee definitely counts among them. Approaches to Van Der Zee have really taken what can be called the art history of photography, an approach that really thinks about Van Der Zee as a singular, spectacular photographer that deserves to be on a pedestal. A photographer that created these kind of rarefied fine art prints, and then also a photographer that's very much affiliated with a certain movement, a moment in time. And for Van Der Zee, it's really been the 20s and 30s of the Harlem Renaissance. That is what the existing historiography on Van Der Zee has told us. My book is the first book in 30 years to discuss Van Der Zee. And in looking back in the existing scholarship, I really found that it overlooked really important aspects of Van Der Zee's work. It really overlooked many of the vernacular aspects of his work. And by vernacular, I mean sort of the opportunity to attend to the everyday uses of photography, how they are making meaning within, local Harlem everyday people who are walking into his studio, who are leaving with prints. A shift away from thinking about the fine art singular print to thinking about the reproduction of prints and its many forms. A real focus on the materiality, a movement away from this privileging of authorship to a real attentiveness to the photographs and its various afterlives. So the major argument that my book makes is that to understand and have a really comprehensive view of the significance of Van Der Zee's work, you really have to look at his work through both an art historical framework and also sort of take a vernacular turn to understand sort of the full scope of the photographs. So within the book, I do this by moving away from identifying him from a singular photographer to one who's really making meaning and engaging in photography as part of a community, this community specifically being other photographers in Harlem at the time. Within a 1 mile radius, Van Der Zee is literally just completely surrounded by other Black photographers who have really not made their way into the art history of photography. And so I really wanted to highlight the fact that he was basically making his living as a commercial photographer, and the photographer he became was really because of that environment, and not necessarily because of his talent that was above and beyond everyone else. I also do that by thinking about the specificity of the format of photography, moving from a fine art print as a location of validity to thinking about reproductions. And I want to bring attention to the Marcus Garvey photograph in particular, one that many scholars have written about. They focus on the composition, the way Marcus Garvey is situated, the view that Van Der Zee is offering its viewers. I do a reading of the composition of the photograph, but then I also want to bring attention to the very ways that the photograph traveled. It was reproduced in newspapers at the time, really throughout the diaspora. So really thinking about the small scale, what it means to look at the photograph in a newspaper, what it means in terms of technologies and ways of seeing, to really take in sort of the graininess of a photograph and also its arrangement among other photographs and the text that is within the newspaper. I also, within my argument, trouble ideas about authorship as well. A part of Van Der Zee's practice, specifically in his later years, were photographs of were restoration work that he did on other photographers' photographs. So it becomes sort of a collaborative kind of practice and one that kind of questions the way art history has sort of named and always privileged the photographer. I also just want to pay particular attention to my chapter 4, which deals with Harlem on my mind. And that really speaks to the slide that we see here, and just this, our general theme for tonight, and thinking about technologies and ways of seeing. Just a quick, how am I doing on time? Quick, good? Okay. Quick background on Harlem on My Mind. It was a highly criticized exhibit that happened in 1969 at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Harlem on My Mind aimed to tell the story and the narrative of Harlem from 1900 to 1968. It did so through photographs that were enlarged, were arranged in sort of a very kind of packed in and busy fashion, and also had a multimedia component. It was a highly criticized show for a number of different reasons, the most pressing criticism being the actual absence of paintings and sculptures by African Americans. Also a lot of, also in terms of, who had a voice in putting on the show, there was an absence of Black artists and those who were living in Harlem. This became an occasion upon so many during 1968, where protests are happening outside of institutions, as different artists and activists are really demanding these institutions to think differently about who gets to be inside these spaces and who gets to make decisions about these spaces. And so you see that in the image over here, one photograph of many that capture the protest that were taking place at the time. I wanted to respect and really build off of scholarship that had been written about Harlem on my mind, which tends to really highlight the Black activism that came out of the show. I also wanted to think about what it would mean to really focus on the act of looking at the photographs itself, and two first-person accounts really inform my approach. Deborah Willis and Dawood Bey, one who is 16 at the time, one who is 21. They walk into the Harlem on My Mind show, and they are absolutely in awe, blown away with what they see. Their sense of wonder is in stark contrast to how the Harlem on My Mind show is usually remembered as being highly criticized. So I wanted to write that chapter to create a space for thinking differently about what it means for Black viewers who are outside of sort of institutional spaces and institutional ways of thinking, or ways of thinking that are in direct relationship to people who want to reform institutions. I wanted to really think about what it meant for a 16-year-old boy to enter that space and see enlarged photographs of Black figures from the 1920s and get really excited and inspired about that. So that is where sort of that chapter builds from. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I echo everyone, and thank you for doing this, Claire, and thank you all for being here. I apologize, I'm losing my voice a little bit, so bear with me on that. And, oh, there's more images than I thought. Okay, it's good I didn't write something out. Okay, so let's see. Well, these images are all from the second chapter of Depth Effects, and Depth Effects has 3 long chapters. The first one is about objects and what it means to try to see a thing or constitute a thing as a thing. The second is about subjects. How do we think a person is visible as a person to another person, and the genre of portraiture that tries to constitute that aesthetically. And then the third is about the world. How do we imagine and visualize the sharedness of a world that we can't see all at once or visually constitute as an object? So this chapter, it's called Surfacing Subjectivity, Portrait Mode and Computational Photography. And it starts with thinking about portrait mode on smartphones, which you're probably all familiar with, and the automation of an aesthetic convention from photography, which is shallow depth of field. So your smartphone, because it has such tiny lenses and it's such a skinny little thing, can't optically produce the shallow depth of field that more traditional or larger cameras can. So it uses computational techniques like depth mapping and forms of facial recognition and other things to produce this effect of focusing a subject in the foreground and pushing the background away and blurring it. And I was interested in what does it mean when this aesthetic is computationally automated as a default norm of everyday picturing that you no longer even necessarily choose. Your phone is identifying human subjects and then giving this aesthetic treatment to the photograph without your active decision. And I was interested in how shallow depth of field is a really racialized aesthetic of portraiture that develops in early portrait photography and early studio portraits, or at least that's my argument. And some of my argument in this chapter draws on other historians and theorists of photography, like Jean-Michel Smith in particular has made really persuasive arguments about this. But I looked at images like this one on the right, my dear friend Rufus Choate, and this is a daguerreotype studio portrait, large format camera, large image. And in some ways, the shallow depth of field there is a function of the material setup of the camera and the studio. But it's also, I argue in this chapter, a really deliberate technique of staging a certain kind of privileged white subjectivity that withholds itself, that does not fully manifest and could not be reduced to bodily appearance. So by creating this play of surface and depth in the image seems to have the capacity to allow the subject to emerge and be suspended for your view, that solicits you as the viewer, as another subject, to see and recognize this special kind of subjectivity. Where on the other hand, there's another tradition of picturing people that's established parallel with this that we're also familiar with, that doesn't afford that kind of hidden interiority because the person is not considered a subject, but more of an object and flattened in the image, or overtly spatialized so that the contours of the body and the measurable dimensions of their visible appearance are considered equivalent with their identity. So in ethnographic images and anthropometric images, the legacy of the mugshot, where the forward-looking, the sideways-looking, dimensionality is still really playing a role, I'm arguing, in the history of photography's aesthetics, in how subjectivity is conferred or not conferred in the way the image treats the person in the picture. So what happens when portrait mode automates this sort of privileged aesthetic of subjectivity, but it uses the techniques of the anthropometric and the automated kinds of quantitative logics that were part of the other tradition to do so. So that's one thing that chapter is thinking about, but then I'm also really interested in every chapter of the book. I spend some time with contemporary artists who their work is exploring, I think, what's at stake in the aesthetic kind of question I'm thinking about, like how is subjectivity imagined to be visible in an image and how is it produced as communicable? And in this chapter, I look at Black female photographers, and I had 3 and then ended up with only 2 in the end, whose work is experimenting with the genre of portraiture, but doing something that refuses to accede to either one of these traditions, right? It doesn't try to convey a subject with a hidden interiority that they may have hitherto been denied, but it also doesn't try to recuperate an anthropometric kind of legacy of photography or reframe it in a different way, which are 2 ways, when you think about what's the legacy of Black studies in this moment, I think that is one way to, the way that has been done in the past, I think it's possible to do this differently now. And so this image is by Latoya Ruby Frazier, and it is one of a pair of images that she has made of herself and her mother that are both titled Mommy, M-O-M-M-E. And the elision in that title is also echoed, you can see, by the visual elision of their faces, the lips aligned, the eyes aligned. And she describes these as self-portraits, but she also describes them as a celebration of her relationship and her bond with her mother, and in particular, how they have stood together and withstood together all forms of racism, sexism, and environmental injustice that has made her family really ill. She's took these 2 portraits 10 years apart, and they're kind of like a stereo pair, and the pairing inside the image is interesting to me too. Stereo pairing and this kind of disjunctive mode of dimensionality is something that I explore in all the chapters of the book. And here in particular, you can see that in some ways it kind of recalls that front and side convention of a mugshot. But on the other hand, it uses that layering to kind of obscure the subject. If this is a self-portrait, the mom gets in the way of seeing seeing the subject of the portrait. But the person who made the image, Latoya Ruby Frazier, is also sort of on the other side of this image, right? So she's in the back and the one who sees the image to frame it. And what this experiment seems to me to be about is an exploration of not just how to find different formal aesthetics of portraiture, but what are the formal aesthetics of portraiture about? And so what would it mean to imagine how subjectivity or personhood can be visually expressed? And maybe what would happen, what kind of photographic aesthetics might emerge if you thought about how the self is always emerging in their personal identity in relation and with others, so that her relationship with her mother is a self-expression in this image. And the way that to see the figures as elided, you have to flatten the image and see it as shapes on a surface. But then also to think about their relationality, you have to imagine the middle of the image that you can't see, that stays between these two women. And the fact that that is held back is a way that it is respected and shown, as this image is about their relationship, but it's also not entirely manifested or disclosed. And I thought that's a really interesting possibility to explore, that it remains between them and it's not for the viewer to see. I don't know how long I talked.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Good. Thank you for coming out this evening, and it's a real honor to be with these remarkable three authors, and say nothing of our formidable chair, keeping an eye on. It's like a kind of game show or something, you know? It's like you have 5 minutes, you're on stage, you have Claire Bishop watching over you. So I'm quite nervous, actually. So this is my book. It's called White Side. This is a book I had no intention of writing, and I didn't want to write, because who would want to write a book about whiteness, right? But, you know, I mean, we've all lived this. We've been through it. 2016 happened. I was in London for Brexit. I was in the United States for Donald Trump. And I thought, I suppose I should say something about this, but I don't know what, because there's a lot of really good work about whiteness and white studies, that much of which has already been referred to here by sociologists and indeed historians. And then Charlottesville happened. And Charlottesville made me think, okay, now there is a way for me to do this, because it's about statues. And thinking back about what Claire was saying at the beginning, in the first wave of visual culture, monuments and so on were a really important part of it. Marina Warner wrote this book called Monuments and Maidens many years ago. That was a really important part of making visual culture what it became. And I think we kind of thought they would just sort of go away. But they didn't, did they? They were still very much there. And so it became really clear in the week immediately after Charlottesville that something needed to happen, obviously. And I wrote a blog post that was called All Monuments Must Fall. And that then became a collaborative syllabus that's still online that you can find. And then it gets interesting, it's like it picked up by people. Paul Preciado used this phrase in Art Forum, of all places, in 2020, and then Gary Young, who is now a professor of sociology, used to be a journalist, writes for The Guardian, had a long piece in The Guardian saying, actually, not just the racist ones, all of them, all figurative statues have to go. So there was this momentum, and then, of course, George Floyd happens. And most of this book then was written during lockdown. It's written in a space where we were sort of very separated, but also intensely in conversation, in assemblies that I participated in every Sunday for 75 weeks, a group of us who came out of 16 Beaver, which is an art space some of you may know, those of you who remember downtown, and came together through Occupy Wall Street and then reconvened many, many times over the course of the pandemic lockdown. And so in that time, I started to think about this idea of not of the history of depictions of whiteness, because we already have that. It's called art history. And not a history of whiteness as a racialized category. This is a specific thing that I want to call white sight, which is a technology that supports colonialism in particular, that's through its techniques of surveillance and surveying, which are always inherently violent, that erase and claim certain forms of space and police them. And this, in this chapter, which is the second chapter, it's in the third chapter, excuse me, I don't have my own book, is the second part of the book, which is about imperial cultures. And in this chapter, I'm focusing on what I call the natural history of white supremacy. And this is a twofold dynamic. On the one hand, whiteness claims dominion over everything, using often biblical reference for that. But it also wants to make itself natural so that its regime is uncontested. It is the way that things ought to be. So in this moment in the 19th century, you see the emergence of what Louis Agassiz, who is the appalling person who created the daguerreotypes of Renti and Delia and the others that are still held imprisoned by Harvard, he called the naturalist's gaze. And the person who made the work on the right, as you're looking at it, who had four names, Jean-Jacques Laforest, John James Laforest, Jean-Jacques Audubon, and John James, I find this really hard to say with the three flat vowels, Audubon. It's really hard to get that out if you don't have an American accent. Payne had talked about nature as it actually exists. This is what he believed he was depicting. But if you've ever seen a heron, it doesn't look like that. What Audubon does is he depicts and works with dead animals. So one of the things that's happened as a result of sexual colonialism is the de-birding, well, of the hemisphere, but of the planet. And so we are not used to the bird world that people lived in previous time. So markets in 19th century America had birds as a cheap, common commodity that were sold as one of the cheapest forms of food. So Audubon would buy birds in markets and then hang them up with wires and then draw them, which he claimed he was doing in imitation of Jacques-Louis David, the neoclassical painter. And if you look at it, you can see the ways in which he's kind of made each of the segments of the bird into a shape and then given this very sharp outline. It is a kind of photograph, even though it's obviously not photographic technique. It's aspiring to that clarity. The background of this image is a plantation. It's called Rice Hope, which is an odd conjunction of terms. The plantation exists because of the technology that Africans brought to the Americas in their heads, the knowledge of how to plant and cultivate rice. And this plantation is in South Carolina. But you'll see that there are no visible people working. So here then, white sight has naturalized the plantation as an inevitable and visible part of the landscape, whilst of course erasing any form of indigenous presence, let alone enslaved Africans. The figure you can see, well actually you can't in this particular version, but in the version that's in the book, Audubon is in there, and he has a mask on and he's carrying a rifle. And he describes in his ornithological biography coming upon a person who he describes as a runaway slave, we might call a maroon or a fugitive, and persuading him in this fantasy to go back to slavery. His history is someone who had grown up in Saint-Domingue, which becomes Haiti. He's driven out of Haiti. He comes to the United States, sets up a mill in Kentucky using enslaved labor, goes bankrupt in one of the many crashes of the 19th century, uses the last two enslaved human beings that he owns to row him down the Mississippi River where he intends to sell them in New Orleans. And on the way down, he sees the birds. He thinks, you know what? I could draw those. So we have him.
Nick, I'm going to hurry you along. Can you just do a
Yeah,
quick bit on the
I was
comfort?
just going to. So I'm sorry, I'm going on too long. I failed my test.
Not advanced to candidacy.
At the end of the book, it was sort of, the end of the book is, at one point was January 6th, and that was just too depressing a place to end the book. So I started to think about what other forms had emerged. And the first gallery show that I went to after the pandemic lockdown was this, which is called Five Murmurations by John Akomfa, British Ghanaian artist. And this is the photo they sent me when I said I wanted to illustrate it, which I thought was interesting, because what I wanted was the birds. With murmurations make those patterns, you know? You can find them on YouTube. This is what they wanted me to put, which is obviously people in 2020 in a form of protest. What that three-screen installation combined was moments from the pandemic lockdown, moments of Black Lives Matter protest, segments from Renaissance paintings, and classic protest photography, if you like, Che Guevara and other images. And I thought, yeah, this is what I'm talking about. And so the murmuration then is a three-dimensional way of creating a social formation. It's not two-dimensional like Whiteside, which is always about policing and patrolling. And it's about individuals coming together to make a set of choices. When birds make a murmuration, they all make an individual choice, which is why they're so unstable. They either go left or right, towards the light or towards the dark. But each individual body makes a separate choice, and that produces a collective formation. And so in the Black radical tradition that Claire mentions, Saidiya Hartman and Fred Moten, who actually pushed me to think more about murmurations, have talked about the murmuration as a way of thinking about a different kind of sociality. So that's where, not to go on too long, that's where I ended with in the book.
Thank you, everyone. That was great. Nick, thank you for bringing up visual culture and making a jab at art history. And I'm going to try and move this towards a disciplinary question, but in a non-defensive way. You know, about 25 years ago, there was a lot of friction between art history, perceived as fusty, elitist, and so on, and this new offshoot called visual studies or visual culture. And Nick's anthology from 1998 was a key moment in that perceived separation. Now, when I talk to students, like some of these people in methods class, about this division, it seems like almost incomprehensible today, right? This is, of course we deal with vernacular materials, of course we deal with high and low culture, and I think this, that debate which needed to happen in the late 90s has now been supplanted by other things which might be perceived as a threat or which are perceived as opportunities. And I'm thinking like one of these being Black Studies. And in November in Art Forum, there was a debate on art history after Black Studies. What it might contribute towards an overall, the sense was of a dismantling of art history that could be accomplished through the tools of Black Studies, and that some of art history's foundational methods like chronology, comparison, and classification, it was argued, reproduce anti-Black and colonial power structures. I was kind of, okay, this was an interesting moment for me to take on board. But I think what's more useful, rather than going for a kind of humanities on humanities, disciplinary conflict, is maybe more productive to think about what are the contributions of Black studies towards an analysis of visuality. What are the terms, the conceptual tools, the vocabulary that you have found most useful in each of your research projects? Who wants to start? Who hasn't talked for a while? Monica, Emilie.
Monica? Okay. You start.
I'm happy to start. I think some of the ideas and writers that have greatly informed my own writing are really thinking about different modes of resistance, and really resistance through I don't want to say resistance with sort of a capital R. I'm thinking about Kevin Quashie's work, in which he's really kind of encouraging us to think about these narratives of resistance that are told over and over about Black individuals as really central to Black narratives and really important, but at the same time they sort of flatten the nuances of Black life. To always equate Blackness with resistance is to not see anything other than resistance. And so I really appreciated that sort of pushback, sort of a recognition of resistance, but then also pushing back on the sort of reductiveness of that, and really a gesture towards thinking about the everyday, thinking about modes of refusal, which Tina Camp has been very, very influential. And then something else that's been very helpful, just thinking about African American art history in general, there's been sort of an ongoing narrative within the subfield of writing counter narratives, narratives that are, against the prevalent narratives, and then sort of writing an alternate story, usually an alternate story against whiteness. And one things that Black Studies has done is that by doing that, you're also recentering whiteness and the dominant narratives. Tell a story about Blackness that really focuses on Blackness and doesn't see Blackness and whiteness in sort of like a Janus face relationship. And so those are some ideas that have really informed the book and also my thinking in general.
Oh, thank you. So a couple of things, maybe building off of what Emilie offered. Thank you for going first. The first is maybe about writing practice, which I sort of started my comment with, and then the second is how we imagine what the encounter is with the visual. So to say a little bit about the first, Tina Camp, Saidiya Hartman, Christina Sharp, Denise Da Silva, these folks to me are staging the encounter with the visual as an opportunity to rethink method and to rethink the writing that we do with the visual. That's sort of one of the main ways that all of their work has really kept me, I think, in the work, is imagining that there could be other forms of writing by way of having an encounter with the visual. So that's the first. And then the second is maybe what the terms of the encounter are. So I have never been a disciplinary cat. I didn't grow up that way, and like in high school I wasn't that kind of a thinker. I wasn't that kind of thinker in college. So I don't know that I know what that is. And so the insistence, I think, in Black Studies work to be attuned to, you'd write about Kevin Quashie's work in your book. Your book is like this, to be attuned to quieter registers in the mode of encounter, right? Like as the mode of encounter, and not imagining the mode of encounter with the visual to be determined either by sort of disciplinary concerns or to be over-determined by a battle, a sort of singular battle with the visual, neither to conquer it, nor to determine it, nor to fix it in some kind of visual taxonomy, periodized genealogy, or anything like that. So that kind of very careful, quieter, slower, subtle attunement and register of encounter with the visual is the other sort of incredible gift, I think, that comes to me by way of Black Studies.
This is a long possible answer, isn't it? I mean, I will not do that. I'm going to say two things very quickly. I'm going to say Cedric Robinson. I mean, the framework that we were using in the late 90s, early 2000s was something like late capitalism. That capitalism was coming in some sense into crisis, into some sort of, but it's always been in there. But what Cedric's work had already done was frame it differently. and said, no, look, you have to think about racism and capitalism being forged symbiotically in the very formation of Europe way back in the 9th century, and that there are stages in that. And so my own book is very much inspired by that, and begins in what Eurocentric criticism would call the Renaissance, or the beginnings of racial capitalism, because I felt I had to respond to that. But then, one of the things that black Marxism is so astonishing is there's so much learning in that book. And there's a whole other book in the footnotes. So there's a reference to John Ruskin in the footnotes. And I thought, what? And I went and looked it up, and real art historians probably know this, but in the lectures on art, he has this kind of crazy idea that British people, English men, should look at the world through what he called an imperial glass, by which he meant a piece of glass that was a mile high and a mile wide, and onto that you would put what he called a sight point, which is a targeting thing. But that's a screen, isn't it? And a big piece of glass through which you look at the world. And I thought, oh, okay. So Cedric Robertson was already there all that long time ago. The other thing I'll say just quickly in relation to the dynamic about visual culture is, on the one hand, yes, Emilie was reminding me, we had a panel at College Art Association in New York a year ago. And there wasn't actually enough room on the podium for all the people we had, because there was all these different points of view, and there were curators, and there were artists, and there were people doing LGBTQ work, and it was just very, very different. The moment, I was the relic up there, and there were all these much more interesting, young, dynamic people doing all of this. And then the final thing, I think, is, and this coming out in all of our presentations, is we're all working with contemporary artists in certain ways now, right? In a way that didn't exist in the late 90s. So, Claire Fontaine, who are my friends, are on the front cover of my book, and that's a piece they made called White Site. And now their whole work, which has been ongoing since 2004, Foreigners Everywhere, is the theme of the new Venice Biennale that's about to open, and has caused all kinds of ructions in fascist Italy, as you can imagine. So I think we're playing in different terrain now. To use your, I think in a moment where there's a genocide going on, like the little tussle between art history and visual culture, who cares? Really. And I said that out loud at the College Art Association in 2003 when we had the war in Iraq. And I think that's the change, really.
Well, that's hard to follow now.
Maybe go.
Yeah, I don't think I turned it off.
So, I think for me, I didn't start out thinking that this book was centrally about race. I thought it was about the relationship between lens-based imaging and then the transformational impact of computational, really algorithmic methods, and how, there's this moment digitization happened and we think that was so important, but really that was nothing. It's what's happening now with algorithmic, and what's going on with that. And I increasingly realized how much this whole story is about how, and in some ways it repeats what you brought up earlier, is like, that's the old insight, that these things are not neutral, that they're sort of racialized norms. But the way that they're calcified in what seem like technological parameters, and how those parameters move across historical moments, even as the technologies change, is really interesting to me, that they slip between what seems like they start to be understood as like a material limitation of the technology, or an affordance, or the way it has to work, instead of a way we've made it to work because of what we assume we're trying to see or make visible through the tool. And so in the chapters, like thinking about photogrammetry, thinking about computer vision and object recognition, thinking about all the things that go on in smartphone photography, realizing how instead of just looking at kind of the exceptions of how do you break it to, like, what's the avant-garde practice, or what is the like heroic Black artist doing that's going against this, really thinking about how the whole presumption of what objects, subjects, or world is. And this is what I see a similarity in how you're thinking of that. Like, these are racialized and exclusionary and violent kind of presumptions in the first place. And so how can we explore the sort of sedimentation of that? And I think Tina Camp's A Black Gay is also really something I resonate with me that you said of like sitting with the work, that, you know, you can try to, this sort of move of mastery of the art historian that says, I fit this in this lineage, I contextualize this in this larger practice, I analyze it, I explain it, I expose it, and therefore we are free of it, or something like that, you know? That I think instead, like the difficulty she really explores in that book of like, sit down on the floor in front of that photograph and see what it asks of you, and think about what you've brought to it that you might not have seen about your look until you're seeing it in relationship to that, how you see that image. And that like reflexive kind of work of thinking about how aesthetics are racially informed and our ways of looking are too, I think has been really powerful for my own research and especially my teaching.
So, well, thank you, Brooke. That's a great segue to a question that I'm left thinking after reading your 4 books, which is, where are we at with thinking through the, media and technology as inherently racialized and politicized constructions, right? Because at each point, each of you in different ways are showing how photography, film, video, techniques of visual surveillance, enclosure, mapping, and so on, are all doing the work of oppression. At the same time, you're also gesturing across to artists who are opening up spaces, new possibilities for lived experience, new ways of exploding the imagination. So, and for a long time, I've been one of these people who automatically thinks technology in itself isn't good or bad. It's the uses that you make of it and so on. But your books make me more uneasy about that. And so I'm wondering, where are you at with that? Because all of your books are in this, have this double-sided Jane has faced relationship to media and technology. Go for it, Monica.
Hi. So I think what I would say is part of why, I think so much about writing and about method is because part of where I think that leaves us is thinking about our teaching, which is what Brooke said, and thinking about our writing, right? So if there is the gift from Black Studies of a different kind of attunement and a different sense of what the encounter is with the visual, then the other gift is that is our site, right? Our site is how we stage the encounter. Our site is how we write about these histories of power and otherwises. So the term that Ariella Azoulay and Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Robin Maynard and Leanne Simpson uses rehearsals, which has done me a lot of good to think with. Rehearsals in the sense of writing differently, finding different methods for being with these histories, but rehearsals also in the sense of being with one another differently because of how we're staging the encounters. Those are where it leaves me, or that's where the sense of always racialized leaves me, is that we have practices, we have rehearsals, we have one another, we have the students, we have the ways that we teach and the ways that we write and the ways that we teach students to see and think and write, and that's what there is. That's where it leaves me, in perpetual rehearsal of maybe something else.
Okay. I think there was a moment where it seemed like there was writing about how, can you make a photographic portrait of a person that is not an oppressive, objectifying image? Are images redeemable when they are part of this history and system? And there's an extreme version that you can't do art history. You can't think about aesthetics. You can't think about any of this. And you just keep coming back to saying, well, there's a war here, that like, why do any of this? And I think that there's something that matters to me about aesthetic practice, whether it's in vernacular forms or whether it's in a gallery, that is about sense-making and making sense, and the way this happens in material and social practices together. So I like the idea of rehearsals, but the object-making aspect of art making matters to me too, that there's this thing and it sits there outside of you and it does work you maybe don't even understand it's going to do. And so I think in the book, I really come back to what is the power of relationality that rests inside these questions of dimensionality. So any image is flattening, any representation takes only one part, but every partial and every perspectival cut, every incomplete representation is another aspect, another face, another rehearsal, another possibility for encounter. It's another thing that sits in the world to invite you into another possible exposure or relationship. And yeah, so I think it's not the technology, it's the technology may be really problematic, but the thing it makes has potentials that exceed that.
I mean, technology is a way to think, isn't it? As well as a way to be oppressed. So I mean, no, seriously. I mean, it's like a plantation was understood in its own time as a machine, and so was a city, so are bodies. But you can turn that around and start. One of the things I've done here is think about all the racist and colonial statues that we've been trying to take down as a network that are in fact a network that stores, as it were, like a database, white supremacy. And when you think of it like that, then you think, oh, actually we do, that's why we need to take them all down, because it's a distributed network like the internet, that they work individually. That you take down the worst one, like you take down Roosevelt outside the American Museum of Natural History, you got another one in Central Park 150 yards away, doing the same kind of work. You take down the Robert E. Lee that is in New Orleans, in Lee Circle, and you go around the corner and there's a museum of the Confederacy with a collection of statues of Robert E. Lee. So technology is a useful way to think. Right? I mean, it allows us to think of and to prioritize the tasks. But I also am mindful of the way that someone like Christina Sharp recently has talked about beauty as a practice, and she talked about the idea of aesthetics as the place where there is nonviolence, so that which is to connect our two comments in a sense, right? It's to think about if you were in a space that was representing people that was nonviolent, then you would have a form of aesthetic, and that's what in an earlier book I called The Right to Look, which is where I look at you and you look at me and we look back at each other, and there's not something formally represented there, but we've all experienced that. I mean, we know what that is. That's love. And that dynamic, if in the right circumstance, in certain ways of working, you can think about how would you take that experience and allow it to shape a represented form, even if it's never quite that. And I don't think we absolutely mustn't give that up, or else we end up in a kind of space of, well, the space that they want us to be in, which is to say everything is terrible and all you can do is act for yourself and accumulate and do all of that. And we have to refuse that.
Great. Emilie, do you want to chip in, or shall we spin the random wheel and ask the public for a question?
I can very briefly chip in, and I'll build off of where Nick talked about in terms of spaces of beauty and creating an aesthetic experience of beauty. I think that happened day in and day out in photography studios in places in Harlem. And one chapter of the book, I spend a lot of time thinking about the embodied experience of what it means to actually step within a studio. Before even stepping within the studio, having a choice of figuring out which studio to step into within a 1 mile radius. The joy and anticipation of, getting dressed that morning before you step into the studio, figuring out how you're going to be posed in front of the camera. I mean, all of those are such moments of intentionality, of joy, of anticipation. And I think those are all within the space that are afforded and really defined almost by photography and the experience of being photographed. I don't think we can lose sight of that, because that's extremely powerful. And for me, that's what defines photography.
And the
Great.
problem is that it becomes this compulsory, how many selfies you must take.
Yes, well,
Right? So the joy of choosing is no longer your choice. Right?
well, maybe not in the 1920s.
Okay,
but
we
yeah.
have about 8 minutes for questions from the audience. Please wait for a microphone if you have a question, so that everyone listening to the live stream can hear.
Thank you. I was wondering if anybody wanted to talk about technology and photography and its ability to fake things. The Times just had a story about how there's some app or program where you can take a picture of any woman and put her on a nude body, and this has destroyed the lives of some teenage girls. And it used to be a photograph was a document of truth. The photo doesn't lie. But of course, that's not true. But now the lies have really increased. And just some comments.
Brooke, is that your domain?
I'm afraid it is. Yeah, so I'm actually working on a piece right now that's about AI-generated images. How do we understand them in relationship to the history and theory of photography that I've been asked to write. And it's so hard because, historians of photography are the first ones to tell you, that we've always been cutting and pasting and manipulating, and it's very hard to draw the line. The truthiness or the aesthetic of objectivity or documentary and evidentiary value is carefully produced and is not essential to the medium. But on the other hand, it's that aesthetic that's really deliberately in play, and in the same way that smartphone photographs simulate depth of field to say this feels like a portrait, there's a sort of photographic aesthetic that is particularly associated with the kinds of what we think the truth claims of photography are, that a lot of AI is tending to automate and regenerate. But I think for me it raises really interesting questions, and I see my book in some ways as let's stop asking the question about what's real and true in photography. That's not what the question of AI is about. It's about how assumptions of what representation is and how it works, and how meaning happens through images, how what we assume an image, how it is analogous or not to human seeing. That these larger kind of questions keep getting reframed in every different version of photography and imaging. And this is yet another opportunity to think through these bigger questions about, what does truth look like to us and why? We answered everything.
Thank you, everyone, for the conversation. I guess I've been thinking about if anybody has anything to say on the panel about photography's relationship to technology that exceeds the kind of oppressive forces of surveillance. I feel like oftentimes when I'm listening to people talk about photography, technology, and race, it's usually under this kind of rubric and guise of just surveillance. So I was wondering if anybody came across any other forces of oppression or exhaustion that don't look like surveillance in the kind of typical ways that we think about, like in terms of capture and algorithms.
I've just talked, but I can say something briefly while you think. So LaToya Ruby Frazier, I think, is one example of seeing this series of images that she's made in a notion of family of her and her grandmother and her mother, is thinking about their exhaustion, the difficulty. And it's, I mean, this is in the mode of like snapshot photography or family photography. It's not surveillance from the outside coming in and watching them, or it's really trying to, using this visual tool within the domestic space and within a kind of intimacy to express and explore. So I think it is getting at how this, I mean, I want to shift your question because I feel like you're asking about how can we find something negative that's not surveillance, and I'm like, well, can't we find something positive that's not surveillance? And I think that's the more interesting question of how you can think photography and Blackness and not about surveillance. That is about like beauty, joy, creativity, subjectivity, embodiment. Like that doesn't have to flip to the problem of surveillance. I don't know. Someone else try.
There's also the practice of surveillance that Simone Brown talked about in Dark Matters, which is watching back from the perspective of those who are presumed to be under surveillance. I also think of the way in which surveillance and perspective always kind of carve out a fairly narrow segment of the visual field, 50 degrees or so. Drones do that. So that leaves you 310 degrees in which you can play and think about other ways to imagine visual relation that isn't from top down and above. And I think, so in that sense then, you know, this, I call it, it's like dark matter to visible matter. There's a lot more of it than the surveillance space, and we should think about how we might use it in that way.
Let's take it up. I think there's two more questions at the front. Maybe we take them together and then we can call answers.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was interested in this idea of materiality and how the art of photography or the practice of photography, it was kind of based in its ability to be matter, to be an object that we look at, and it's shifted with the kind of advent of smartphones into a digital sphere. And if there's been also a shift, or how you imagine a shift in kind of the oppressive forces of photography operating slightly differently with the erosion of the materiality of the art.
And let's, yes, give you a question as well. We'll put that all together.
So my question actually connects to surveillance, but not surveillance. In connection to what this talk is about, when I think of surveillance, I think of the gaze of what is being surveyed. So if you could talk from that intersection of, connected to his question, but from that intersection of that gaze. So you talked about white sight. You had other things in which you all did in your research, the gaze in that intersection of the work. So, yeah.
Okay, anyone feel like joining these together or taking one or other of them? Materiality or the gaze?
Take the second one, which is material, but not in those terms. So the first chapter, in my first chapter, I'm talking about performance. And one of the things that was a very unexpected offshoot of research was this chapter on performance, because part of what I found, it's about American Delsartism. So it's a very specific performance practice that sort of is a pivot point between melodramatic performance and what we would call realism in theater. And one of the things that was surprising when I read the teaching manuals of American Del Sartes was not only a specific way that actors and society ladies were being encouraged, taught to be in their bodies, but that they were also being taught to become surveillors by the way that these women were being taught to think about their own bodies and what their own bodies were capable of, what other bodies might not be capable of, but also how that meeting point between what my body is capable of, what another body is capable of, happens by way of this practice of thinking about what it is that you're even doing in space when you're carrying your body one way or another. So it's material in the sense that it's a practice, but it's not necessarily about the materiality of the camera, the technology, but about this sort of the sense of expression that I'm trying to understand in that first chapter that I then used to read all the court cases after that. Because that, I mean, to me, that, there is this huge body that thinks about whiteness as identity, and part of the work that Nick is doing, that I was trying to do, is to not limit us to what is actually an ill fit for how whiteness works in the world, but how the unique relationship between whiteness and power in white supremacist worlds that is very different from other kinds of racial identities. So in thinking about whiteness as an aesthetic or whiteness as a gaze, that work is sort of helping us do that. And that first chapter was how I was trying to understand that kind of relationship between how do people come to believe themselves to be arbiters of surveillance? How do people come to believe themselves to be the camera that's watching, to be the camera that can taxonomize, determine, and foreclose possibilities for other folks based on looking at them? So that's what the first chapter is doing.
I think there's an expectation that we should finish now, but actually I think that's a very nice way of wrapping up, of taking whiteness beyond identity to a technology. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you all for listening. The books are available for sale outside. Please go, and these people will even sign a copy if you buy one, and then you can have a drink upstairs.
Thank you all. Thank you.